Get this thing started. Ooh. I got quiet. You must think it's time to start. All right, good morning, folks. I don't have a huge amount on this fifth chapter of Lamentations, so I wasn't in a rush to get us started. But does anybody have any announcements or prayer requests before we get going into this? All right. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together here and to look at your word. We thank you for this book that was written by you through men over the course of centuries, and that we have it and we can learn about you and your interaction with us. Help us to learn the things that you would have us to know. Help us to rightly apply it into our lives. Thank you for this congregation that gathers here. Help us to do things that are pleasing to you. Be with each of us as individuals. Be with the struggles that each of us faces. Help us to live our lives in a way that's pleasing to you. Help us to spread your good news and to be influential to those around us, those in the community, and those seeking you. Thank you for sending us your Son, Jesus. Thank you for his life on this earth, his death on the cross, and his resurrection. These prayers and thanks be given in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we're going to be in the final chapter of Lamentations. And as I said, I don't have a lot because it's 22 verses. And I've done 2 other chapters, so I've kind of given the overview of the book. The book of Lamentations is believed to be written by Jeremiah. In fact, a lot of Bibles will say the Lamentations of Jeremiah. He never identifies himself in the writings, so some scholars have questioned that, but I believe, and I think it's still the majority believe it was Jeremiah, and there's some evidence for that. We looked at that particularly when we were in chapter 3. Of course, the book, as we pointed out before, it's poetry. I'm told that it's very beautiful poetry, particularly in Hebrew. Some of that is lost in the translation because it's acrostic. The first 4 chapters, so not the chapter 1 today, followed the alphabet. So each verse, there were 22 verses, and there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, except for chapter 3, where there were 66, and they repeated each letter 3 times. Now, chapter 5 doesn't follow that. and also the same rhythm that it was written in Hebrew, where it was 3 lines and then 2 lines and 3 lines and 2 lines. The first 4 chapters followed that. The 5th one doesn't follow any of those writing styles that made the first 4 unique in Hebrew. So there have been attempts, particularly by German translators, to try and keep some of that acrostic nature and some of the rhythms, but for the most part, it's not been able to be recreated that way in other languages as what it is like in Hebrew. Now this one, not being written in that style, this chapter, I imagine that at least makes the translator's job easier, because they're not like, oh, how do we try and preserve this? Because this one, yeah, it's still poetry, but there's not a particular writing style to it. This has led some to believe this was written later. We don't really know exactly when any of it was written, so we couldn't say for sure. I certainly feel like with the descriptions of some of the tasks that they've gone with, whereas the previous chapter talked about the destruction of Jerusalem. Basically, a lot of people have said Jeremiah wrote this while sitting on a rubble heap. This one begins to talk about some of their difficulties in exile. So whether it's was written later or the whole book was written late enough, the concept in this is a little bit farther. It's like a little more removed in time, because it talks about, let's see. In verse 13, it says, they took the young men to grind, and the children fell under the wood, referring to the manual slave labor that they were, kind of pressed into. And it's also going to talk about reaching out to Egypt and to Assyria in order to buy bread, and having to buy back their own things. They're buying their own water and things like that. So this seems to be, after the collapse and dealing with the exile. As such, it's a little different in time. It's written from it's not really written from a personal perspective. It's written as the congregation. A lot of scholars have said it's written as the church. I guess you could say that, but really, like when the Israelites gathered together in some of the Mosaic writings, and they're referred to as the congregation, it's really written from that perspective. It's like, remember us. It's written plurally. Like verse 1, remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Consider and behold our approach. And then it gets into describing all that. So the writing style, that's kind of the how it's written. It's written from that perspective. And written, obviously, during the exile, as I said. And as we get to the end, we'll see how they are requesting that the Lord restores them, which, of course, we're after the event, so we know after 70 years they were restored. At least a remnant was, and they did get to rebuild. So we begin to see in this that concept of restoring us, and like I said, that's at the end of the chapter, so we'll get to that. But if I were to give you the short version of this book, verse 1 starts out, remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Consider and behold our reproach. So that's the beginning, is remember. And then it's going to go through all these verses describing what has fallen upon them. Verses 2 through 14 are all these things that happen to them. Really, if you think of it as these are the physical, actual things that happen, and then somewhere around 15 to 18 that kind of describe the emotional things. It'd be more like what we'd call the mental health picture of this, where, for example, in 15 it says, the joy of our heart is ceased. Our dance is turned into mourning. So he goes through, he describes all these actual events, and then they get into, the emotions in those verses 15 to 18 or so. But then it really goes back to the beginning in that final few verses. Verse 20, it re-asks the same question that it started out with. Remember, wherefore dost thou forget us forever and forsake us so long? It's that same question that was asked at the beginning, remember us. But also in verses 21 and 22, it asks for restoration, for them to be restored to God and not rejected. And of course, that being, the idea. And last week, when looking at chapter 4, we discussed how all this was predicted in the blessings and the cursings that Moses had laid down all those years ago. God had said, if you do these things, you'll be blessed. If you do these things, this is going to happen to you. And it described it in, pretty accurate detail, and that's exactly what did happen. So I'm just going to read this whole chapter, and then we'll kind of go through it. That's the basic outline of the chapter. So Lamentations chapter 5. Remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Consider and behold our reproach. Our inheritance is turned to strangers, our houses to aliens. We are orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. We have drunken our water for money. Our wood is sold unto us. Our necks are under persecution. We labor and have no rest. We have given the hand to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread. Our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. Servants have ruled over us. There is none that doth deliver us out of their hand. We got our bread with the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. They ravished the women in Zion and the maids in the city of Judah. Princes are hanged up by their hand. The faces of elders were not honored. They took young men to grind, and the children fell under the wood. The elders have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music. The joy of our heart is ceased. Our dance is turned into mourning. The crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us that we have sinned. For this our heart is faint, and for these things our eyes are dim. Because of the mountain of Zion, which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it. Thou, O Lord, remainest forever, thy throne from generation to generation. Wherefore dost thou forget us forever, and forsake us so long a time? Turn thou us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. But thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. So, as I pointed out, verse 1 starts with that request. Remember us, O Lord. Consider and behold our reproach. And as was pointed out, they'll get back to that. But then they begin to describe that reproach that they're asking the Lord to remember. And the first thing they mention in verse 2 is that our inheritance is turned to strangers, our houses to aliens. So inheritance was an important thing in that culture, probably even more so than in our culture. So their inheritance, their land, their houses, they were given to strangers and aliens. It says, we are orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. So those that, there were many that were orphaned and fatherless, but it also points out their mothers are as widows. So those even that weren't widowed were as widows. They were in that same situation of difficulty. In verse 4, it points out that we have drunken our water for money. Our wood is sold unto us. So they're pointing out they have to pay for the things that used to belong to them. They're buying their own water. They're buying their own wood. I couldn't help but personally think when I was reading that this is a good reminder that this is what happens when you forget that everything belongs to God. Because here they're still going, we're buying our water. We're buying our wood from strangers. And yep, that can happen. But and of course we understand their circumstance. God had intended this, but I think that could apply to any of us. Is um, always remember it's not our stuff. And then it continues in 5. It says, "Our necks are under persecution. We labor and have no rest." Verse 6 says, "We have given the hand to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread." I found this verse interesting, just reading it in different translations. Because the way it's worded here in the King James and in the American Standard and others, that is the way it is written. We have given the hand. Of course, the concept being that they've had to make treaties and submit. And interestingly enough, reading in other versions, like the New International Version, reads, "We submitted to Egypt." So it very much is an example between formal equivalence, translation, and dynamics. The versions that are known to be formal equivalents all read, "We have given the hand to Egypt and to Assyria to get bread enough." Whereas those that follow the concept will read "submit," because that's the concept being described here. It's like, we've given the hand, we've submitted to the Egyptians and Assyria to get enough bread. And not so much, I'm not really bringing that up to point out one's right or wrong. I just think this is a very classic case of that's your translation styles. There is exactly what you get to see. Are they translating it to get the idea across, or are they translating it so it reads close in the actual words that are used? But that's another one of their complaints. They've had to make treaties. They've had to submit to these foreign powers in order to get enough bread, enough food to eat. Verse 7, I'm going to run out of hands here, says, "Our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities." There was a verse that reminded me of back in Jeremiah. I think it was Jeremiah 16. I'll start in verse 9. It says, "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I will cause to cease out of this place in your eyes and in your days the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride. And it shall come to pass, when thou shalt show this people all these words, and they shall say unto thee, Wherefore hath the Lord pronounced all this great evil against us? Or what is our iniquity? Or what is our sin that we have committed against the Lord our God? Then shalt thou say unto them, Because your fathers have forsaken me, saith the Lord, and have walked after other gods, and have served them, and have worshipped them, and have forsaken me, and have not kept my law. And ye have done worse than your fathers. For behold, you walk every one after the imagination of his evil heart, that they may not hearken unto me. Therefore will I cast you out of this land into a land that ye know not, neither ye nor your fathers, and there shall ye serve other gods day and night, where I will not show you favor." So I was just reminded of that passage, which really describes exactly what's happening here when it says, "Our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities." Clear back there in the beginning of Jeremiah, God was saying, when they asked, tell them why. Well, your fathers have sinned, and you have done even worse than your fathers. Continuing on in verse 8, it says, "Servants have ruled over us. There's none that doth deliver us out of their hands." One of the things when there was the political takeover is there were other servants placed over them. You could look at that from There were the servants of Nebuchadnezzar that came in and took over things, but also, they left, people as governor that were not, they weren't the royal family, they weren't princes and lords, and they made people that had been servants those of rule, and we know that was something that bothered some people, and we went over some of that in Jeremiah. And then it continues in verse 9. It says, "We got our bread with the peril of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness." You know, this, I'm not sure. This is part of why I think this might be written later. Particularly because it talks about, having given the hand to the Egyptians and the peril in the wilderness, because Jeremiah, as you'll remember, stayed behind, and it said there was plenty in the land until there was the political coup and they all ended up fleeing to Egypt. So this whole concept of having peril in the wilderness, it might be in the wilderness for those being carried off to Babylon, but more specifically probably in the wilderness while they were fleeing down into Egypt. I suspect things were not particularly nice when you're, fleeing by night because you're going to be in trouble because you assassinated the governor that Nebuchadnezzar had left behind. In verse 10, I think I had some notes on that. Verse 10, "Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine." I thought that was interesting, but I looked up the word, and it can mean black or burned, and you'll have some translations that say our skin was burnt like in the oven. Both is relatively accurate, but the word there, it can mean black in an oven, or it can mean shriveled. It's like fruit that's all like turned black in the sun and shriveled up. It's kind of what that word means there. Verse 11, it says, "They ravished the woman in Zion and the maids in the city of Judah." I ran across some of the more modern translations that said rape, which I think may be what's referred to, but ravish is a better translation of the word because the word was innu, I-N-N-U, which can be translated afflict, abuse, defile, or ravish. So that seems to be a relatively accurate translation there. In verse 12, it says, "Princes were hanged up by their hands." I wasn't sure if that referred to, torture. If it didn't say hung by the hand, I know many of them were killed by hanging, which they hung people by hanging them on spikes. But most scholars that I looked at discussing that believe that they were hung up by the hands, that it's referring to the corpses. They were put on display. Whether that's true or whether it was how they were killed, but princes hung up by their hands. Whether that was after they were dead or how they were killed, I think that's pointing out that those princes were, made a public example of. And then it continues, "The faces of the elders were not honored." And of course that word elder, it works just like our word elder in the New Testament. It could refer to old people, or it could refer to those of influence or a particular station. We just as we determine that by the context, that word worked the same way in Hebrew. The elders were not honored, whether they're just saying the old people were not honored, or whether they're pointing out those of influence within the society. And since they're lumped in there with the princes, that may be the case there. But at either rate, they've got these princes that are hung up by their hand as a display, and the elders were not honored. And then 13, it says, they took the young men to grind, and the children fell under the wood. And, they taken the young men off to run the grinding, to work in the mill, so to speak. And the children falling under wood, that's like they're having the children do heavy labor. They're carrying loads of firewood or construction wood. I don't know what kind of wood. They're referencing, heavy labor here. Verse 14, it says, the elders have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music. I think this is noteworthy because the gate, we know, was where business was done. We have examples like in Ruth where, the elders sat in the gate, and if you had business to do, you went there and did it. But also, it was also the social center. One of the things about Hebrew culture is Hebrew culture didn't really have coffee shops or bathhouses. Those would be introduced by Rome. They didn't have public houses, social places. So that setting in the gate, that also references that the social life did not exist anymore. And that makes sense to me. Not only have the elders ceased from the gate, those that would be doing business and making arrangements, but the young men from their music, that social level has broken down. It's gone. And I think that makes sense. As you continue in verse 15, this is when you begin to get into, like I said, more the emotion rather than the actual things that happened. But the next thing they point out after saying the young men have ceased from their music is that the joy of their heart is ceased. Our dance is turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe unto us that we have sinned. So I think that's a continuation, and that's why, things being ceased from the gate is noteworthy. It's like all of this stuff is gone. All of our social life is gone. And the music's gone. We no longer are dancing. We're mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe unto us that we have sinned. I think it's worth pointing out that that's a very important verse because they have acknowledged that they have sinned. And then it continues on, for this our heart is faint, for these things our eyes are dim, because the mountain of Zion, which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it. So as I said, they switch after describing people being gone from the gate to more describing their sadness, their emotional loss over those things. Also, I looked up the word for fox because oftentimes I find that the animal names in the Old Testament in the Hebrew doesn't get translated well, but it does look like that word usually means fox. It sometimes is translated as jackal, and I think I ran across a couple translations that did translate it that way, but either is accurate, and it describes, foxes or jackals, but the word actually is animals that live in a hole. So as the foxes have holes is kind of how they got their name in as far as the etymology of the word. And then you get into this last, there's kind of a paragraph change. It says, Thou, O Lord, remainest forever, thy throne from generation to generation. Wherefore dost thou forget us forever, and forsake us so long time? Turn thou us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. But thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. So here they're putting this supplication to God, saying, Thou, O Lord, remainest forever, thy throne from generation to generation. And then it gets into verse 20. It says, Wherefore dost thou forget us ever, and forsake us for so long a time? And I thought that read a little, what did I say? It seemed a little clunky, but I looked at the Hebrew, and there's not much else of a way to translate that. This whole passage here, wherefore dost thou forget us ever and forsake us for so long a time? It's fairly straightforward. But in 21, it says, turn thou us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. Seems like they kind of say the same thing over and over, but in Hebrew, it's actually a different word every time. Where it starts out and says, turn us again, that word is haspenu, which is oftentimes translated as turn or turn back. And then when it says, and we shall be turned, that word is winashabu, which is often translated as come again, return, go again, or return again. So even though it sounds very similar in English, turn thou us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall be turned. It's more different of words in Hebrews. And then when it says renew our days of old, restore, the word there is hods, which is often, well, it's not used as often, but when it is, it's been translated as renew, repair, or restore. So that idea of turn us back to you, O Lord, and restore, just like we would use restore or repair. You know, if I wanted to restore a car, I've got to repair things. So that's the idea, is to turn us back to you, O Lord, and repair or renew the days of old. And then 22, it says, but thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. The word that the King James translates but is im. It's usually translated, it's used like 766 times. So it's been translated a lot of different ways. It's a very common word. And like I said, they translated it but. It's often translated if, unless, or but. Those are the most common ways it is translated. And you will find other versions, I think it was the New King James that I looked at, that used unless instead of but. Let me see. Yes, the New King James reads, unless you have utterly rejected us and are very angry with us. But the and is in italics in the New King James. So in the New King James, those last few verses starting in 19 read, you, O Lord, remain forever, your throne from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? Turn us back to you, O Lord, and we will be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are very angry with us. So I don't know if that reading makes any difference to you. I had to read that 2 or 3 times before I was like, I think that's what he's saying, is that unless you've rejected us and are very wroth against us, but the and is not in the original Hebrew. As I said, it's in italics in the New King James when they add and. But that's at least how I am taking the passage to be what they're asking, is turn us back to you, O Lord, and we shall be turned, and renew our days as of old, unless thou hast utterly rejected us and are very wroth against us. But like I said, there's no and there, so maybe I'm reading that wrong, but that word but or unless, that either one is actually an acceptable translation of what they're trying to say there. So in which case, I guess even if you left the and out, it's unless you have utterly rejected us, thou art very angry against us. So I guess that still portrays the same idea. And that's all I have in my notes on this. Does anybody have any questions on any of that? you get this final chapter, and I like how it ends because the final verses of the final chapter are them asking to turn. They're asking God to turn them back towards Himself and to renew the days of old. Um, they've recognized they've sinned. They're asking to be turned back. Like I said, we have the advantage of looking at this later, and we recognize after 70 years, they they were turned back, and they did get to return and restored as of the days of old. So, um,
Looking at the end of that, and the idea that it's poetry and that it's a prayer,
mm-hmm,
that begging, are you going to forget us forever? Turn us back, restore us, that begging to be
mm-hmm,
returned. But then also the feeling and the observation, you've utterly rejected us. So those things seem like maybe a contradiction, but you can understand that like in your own life and praying for things. You want one thing and you feel something else, and it all comes together. I think it's a really good expression
mm-hmm.
of that feeling of begging to be restored and feeling like it's impossible
Right.
at the same time.
Yeah, because like I said, there's three different wards. They say it three different ways in verse 21 to turn them back unto you, restore, be turned, turn back. But then that feeling in 22 of, but you have utterly rejected us. Yeah, that absolute dismay is kind of conveyed there. That's why I had to read it like two or three times because I'm like just trying to get an idea of what they're actually saying there. So it does convey that very strong emotion. So anything else? All right. Well, we can take a break and get ready for worship here.
Where are we going next?
I think we're going into Ezekiel,
It
right?
has to go into Ezekiel.
Okay. And do you have that next week?
All right, so you're going to be